Well, hello and welcome to this introduction to Worldviews for the Philip Project. My name is Mark Coffey and I teach religion and philosophy. And this is my introduction to what is a worldview. We're all getting used to online learning. I, as a teacher, certainly am. So this is a Prezi presentation on that very subject. And I'm going to start with a story. This is a story about the USS Jeannette, a ship, and it sank in the Arctic Ocean in 1881. What was it doing there? Well, there was this belief that if you could go up to the Arctic Circle, the polar sea would meet you. What wasn't there was, they believed, solid ice packs, but a sea. So if you could get through the Gulf Stream, then you could come out the other side in what's called the Curacao, and you would be met by a massive sea. The problem was that their map of the world was completely wrong. What happened was the ship got frozen in ice and it got locked in the ice, crushed the ship, which sank, and of the 31 sailors that set out, only 13 survived. What does this tell us about worldviews? Well, it tells us that our culture often sells us faulty maps of the good life, and that our maps work on our imagination and our hearts and our minds, and we need a good compass, a good map of the territory. People had to, in a sense, conform their view of reality to what was really there, which was not an open sea, but which was an ice pack. And so we have to think, each of us has a worldview, a perspective on reality. And if it's at odds with reality, then that's going to cause problems for us. There are a number of diagrams on the internet that you can find on the subject of worldviews. And here are a few. The idea that we have presuppositions that we start out with, that there is a God or there isn't a God, or that the only way to know and understand the world is science. We have certain ideas and beliefs that shape us, and values. We might value democracy, or we might value freedom. That would be a value that we place on the world. At the heart of this is the question, what can we know for certain and how do we know it? And related to that, where do we come from? What kind of stories are we going to tell ourselves? What is the purpose and meaning of life, if there is one? What are we here for? What's the fundamental problems that we have to deal with in life, and what are the solutions to these? And worldviews are complex. They're built up of placing ourselves in families and communities and societies, all of which shape our views, our beliefs, creating a worldview. We have an education, and we have a personality, our own emotional makeup. We might be optimistic in life and be very positive. We might be pessimistic and tend to catastrophize and think it will always be bad. Things will always be bad. Here's an outline of 14 worldviews in some detail. And what this worldview chart does is to look at the place each worldview gives to God, the world, and the individual. So an agnostic who says maybe there's a God, maybe there's not, is practically going to live as an atheist. They're not going to put time and commitment into their belief in God, because they don't believe there's sufficient evidence to know that or not. There's an atheist who's committed to the belief that there's no God, and to persuading other people that they should give up their belief in God. People like Richard Dawkins would take that view, and they tend to see science and religion as kind of in conflict with one another. So there are lots of different worldviews there, and you can take your time to have a look at them. Christian theism is the one that we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at, but there are lots of them: nihilism, theism, polytheism, pantheism. You can follow this Prezi and look at these worldviews in more detail yourself at a later point. So I'm going to begin by giving us a little bit of history on this subject of worldviews here. And at the heart of this is how we see the world. What is our worldview? One way of exploring this is to ask ourselves, what does it look like when your worldview collapses? So here are a few pictures of collapsing worldviews. So on the left-hand side here, this is the American Revolution, when they're pulling down a statue of King George and America is separating from England. This is a statue of Stalin that's been pulled down at the end of communism. And this is a statue of Christopher Columbus in Venezuela that's being pulled down, who supposedly discovered America, even though there were native peoples. Whenever we look at statues like this collapsing, there's another one there of Stalin and one of Hitler after the Second World War. People are destroying pictures. You start to see a whole order, whole worldview, a way of looking at the world that has just entirely collapsed, and people are having to put something in its place. A good example of this is the film Finding Lenin. And in this film, I'll just play you the last sort of scene of it here. In this film, Finding Lenin, there is a boy, a young man. I'm not sure if that video is going to play. I don't think it is. There's a young man, and he essentially is he's waiting for his mother to come out of hospital. She's had a heart attack, and this is in 1989 with the collapse of communism, and the doctors say that he can't do anything that will upset her, make her worried and nervous. And so she's in hospital, she comes out of hospital, and he has to pretend to create an entire world of pretense that there is, everything's carried on as normal. Communism hasn't collapsed, the end of the world hasn't carried on, and there's a massive Stalin statue or Lenin statue that's being taken by a helicopter in the final scene of the movie away, and the mother comes out into the streets and realizes what's going on, and that that world has collapsed. There are a number of individuals here who've talked about how their worldview changed. Melinda Gates visited Africa, and it opened her eyes to the suffering of the world, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was established. Tom Brookwell is a journalist who said that when he witnessed the assassination of JFK, the entire view of the world in America changed. So we can see that we often have assumptions about the world, and that events cause us to change our view. We're living through a time of crisis at the moment with coronavirus, and who knows what shockwaves will be sent through the economic systems of the world in the aftermath of this. We may well have to change our view of the world. So that's one way in which we can examine this concept of worldview. Another is to look at its history. And here I want to look at this German term, which is Weltanschauung. And this is a term that is first used by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And it's a simple idea, really. He's saying, generally speaking, before this time in Britain and other parts of the world, people were empiricists, right? They said, we have five senses, taste, smell, touch, hearing, sight, and we look at the world, and this gives us information about the world, data about the world. So where does the knowledge, the truth come from? It comes from our senses accurately seeing and interpreting the reality of the world out there. Reality is all in the physical world, and Our job is just to have accurate instruments to sort of see, feel, hear, and touch and taste things. Kant says no, that's too simple, because our minds bring a Weltanschauung. They bring a view to reality. We see the world, as it were, through spectacles. If I have some, dark spectacles, suddenly I've got a different perspective on the world. And Kant says we are born with spectacles that we can't take off. We're quite different to other animals. A good example of this would be the category he has of causation. If you throw a ball into a room and there's a cat there, the cat will immediately jump on the ball, thinking it's alive. But a human being will look and think, where did the ball come from? Because we think in terms of cause and effect. Where is cause and effect? It's in here. It's not out there. And a similar thing can be seen in time. We have a heart, and the heart only beats a finite number of beats. We will die. We are mortal. And so built into us is this sense of time, because we have a clock. And that's not out there in the world. That's in here in our mind. So we construct a lot of reality from the worldview that has been shaped by our parents, by the society we've grown up in, by the media, by lots of influences, our education. That all shapes the way we look at the world. So that's the origin of the word in the 18th century in the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant uses the word Weltanschauung, which is where our word worldview comes from. Now, another way of looking at this entirely is to look at the great 5th century thinker, Augustine. And Augustine had this idea that we are not really rational as human beings. We're passional. We are driven not by our minds. We like to think that we're driven by our minds most of the time, but we're often driven by our hearts and our desires. And he says this, my weight, my momentum is my love. Wherever I am carried, my love is carrying me. In other words, the things that really drive our worldview are not so much up here with lots of ideas. They're more to do with what we really value and treasure. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. What do you treasure in life? That's your worldview. And Augustine understands that. He says, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, O God. So we are what we love. That's the title of a book I've been reading recently on this. We are what we love. And another philosopher who takes this idea up is Alistair McIntyre, who says, humans, we're storytelling animals. And we can only answer the question, what should I do? If you ask, first of all, what story or stories do I find myself a part of? What's the story of your life? Is it one of ambition, get yourself an education, get the highest paid, most high status job you can get? What is the story that drives your life? Is it one of your family is the most important thing in your life and everything's about commitment to your loved ones? Is that your story in life? We all have a story, and we're part of a bigger story that society is telling us about what makes you valuable. Are you valuable because you're beautiful? Are you valuable because you're intelligent or rich? These are stories that we're told by our society. Another thinker that's important, I think, in understanding worldviews is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor, he's written a massive book of nearly 900 pages, which is fantastic, called A Secular Age. And he really tells the story of the last 500 years. And he says, how is it that back in the 1500s, it would have been impossible to even think that God didn't exist? That would not be an idea that you would find around. People just, everywhere they looked, there was evidence of God in creation, in the marvels of how we're made and how the body works, in the beauty of the world and how we express that as human beings, in the fact that we have a conscience, we have a sense of right and wrong. So everywhere people looked, there was evidence of God. And yet 500 years on, even if you're religious, it's just one view among many worldviews. And he's trying to sort of explain in terms of history how we got there. And he says it's not just a story of the rise of science, and with science everybody becomes more secular, less religious. He says that's not true, because actually science grows up in Judeo-Christian society where that's very favorable to science. It says the world is not something to be worshipped, it's something to be investigated. God made the world, he put human beings in it to investigate it and to be stewards of it, and so we should study the world. Now, one of the things that Taylor points out is that in the ancient world, human beings were very porous. Something which is porous means that it's open to things outside it. Like we might say a sponge is porous because you can put water into it and it will take the water and absorb the water. Whereas something that's not porous would repel the water. A waterproof coat would not be porous. So how are human beings porous? Well, in the ancient world, and for many religious people today, they're open to God through prayer, through religious experience, through worshipping with other people, and they see the world, they see beauty in the world as a product of God's creation. They see order in the cosmos as evidence of God, the great mind, the mathematician behind creation. And everywhere they look, there's an openness to this spiritual reality that's part of their worldview. But in the modern world, what Taylor says is that we start to tell ourselves stories. Very often in secular scientific worlds, there's a story that's going on parallel to the science. So there's a science which is evidence-based and driven by the scientific method of investigation. But alongside that, there are some kind of claims that get smuggled into the story that aren't scientific at all. The claim that there is no reality other than that which science provides us with. We sometimes call this scientism. And that's what he calls the buffered self. This is a self that is non-porous, that kind of says we're never going to accept any religious explanation, any belief in God or the supernatural. We're going to push those to the edges, and we're going to kind of encase ourselves and block out any hearing or any sense that there could be objective right and wrong, or there could be a sense that as human beings, there is a meaning, there is a purpose to our lives. So Taylor's very important in that. And what he draws out is this idea of plausibility structures. In other words, 500 years ago, it would have just been impossible to even think that it could be rational to believe in a world without God. The evidence was overwhelming, and it just was implausible to take that view. Whereas for many secular people today, religious belief in God seems implausible. They don't think that is worth the time of day. And he's saying that's not something that's built on evidence and reason. That's just kind of background assumptions. A lot of people have a background assumption that you don't need to give faith in God the time of day. It's just, we can dismiss it without even thinking about it. And if you're intelligent and educated and you're scientific, then you just kind of, obviously, you wouldn't go with a religious explanation. That is not based on science and reason. It's based upon this assumption, the stories that people tell themselves that kind of creep into their worldview. So another important thinker on this is James Sire. And James Sire, he tells this story by giving us some key questions to ask. He says that it's a bit like an iceberg. We act in our lives, but we do that on the basis of a worldview that goes beneath the surface of our actions. It has a whole load of values and assumptions built into it that are the kind of below the surface thing that drive our actions. And C.S. Lewis, the writer, puts it like this: what you see in here depends a good deal on where you're standing and what sort of person you are. So your personality comes into it, but your perspective, where you're coming from, is part of your worldview, and it will decide the direction you go in life. If you think that life is about making money and making yourself successful in terms that many people in the world would think, that you're rich, that you dress well, that you've got nice things in life, if that's your story, that's where you're standing. And so everything that you do will be driven by that kind of worldview. And what James Sire says is there are 6 or 7 questions that we need to ask ourselves here. What is the most real thing there is? And for theists, obviously, the answer to that question is not human beings, and it's not the physical world, because there was a time before the world was created, and there will be a time after that. And we, although we seem very real and physical, one day we'll die. So the reality has to be something beyond that. And that's an interesting question from theists' point of view. What is the nature of external reality and the world around us? What is a human being? Now, if you say we're basically just naked apes, we're mammals, and we've evolved, and that's all there is to us. We have brains. We're just purely physical all the way down, and that's the nature of human beings. That's going to affect the way you approach issues like euthanasia. Is it okay for people to take their own life if they're terminally ill? It's going to affect the way you think about abortion. Is it okay to terminate the life of an infant before it's born, a prenatal infant, a fetus? Is going to have an impact upon your ethics if you think human beings are just physical, and that's going to orientate the way you look at life. What happens to a person at their death? Again, if you think that we don't have a soul and we're purely physical, then when you die, that's the end of everything. Can we know right and wrong? The idea Christians have is that God has revealed in the Bible the 10 Commandments, and these are a guide for our life. Now, do not steal, do not kill, do not commit adultery. They reflect something of the character of God, who is holy and good, and therefore we should be holy as God is holy. So how do we know right and wrong? Do we believe that we have a conscience that God has built into us? Or do we think that conscience is just a product of the upbringing we have had, the environment we've grown up in? Is there a meaning to human history? Is history just a sort of, as Shakespeare said, a sort of tale full of sound and fury, signifying nothing? Or is it a directional history? Is it moving from creation to a final judgment? Or is history just moving in circles of birth, death, reincarnation? Or is there no real meaning to history other than what human beings create? This is part of our worldview. And what are the life-orientating commitments that we should have that are consistent with this worldview? So if I think that human beings are made in the image of God, that they're sacred, they have a dignity, then I'm going to think everyone's equal. God has made everybody, and everybody's equal. It doesn't matter where you're born, or what race or gender you are equal in God's sight. That is a commitment that will flow from my worldview. Now, there is a link here to various other worldviews that you can pick up. So you might take the Prezi and have a look at that. James Sire, he sets out a whole load of worldviews here, and he goes into some detail about them. So we've mentioned other worldviews, but I'll just show you some of them here. So he sets these questions out and compares theism with atheism, with Islam, postmodernism, and he gives you what their answers would be to each of these questions. So that might be worth clicking on and having a look at. So we've looked at lots of things in this overview. I want to just sort of finish with a video here. Let's just see if we can play this video. Let's just see. Sorry about that delay there. Technology is a wonderful thing. So this is a video that's just exploring the idea of worldviews, and a couple are meeting in a cafe, and they're discussing their different worldviews. So have a listen to this.
This fortune cookie. Life's journey ends with a new beginning.
Whoa, that's deep. But in the real world, life's journey ends with an ending. When you die, you're done.
Well, yes, your body no longer works, but your soul continues to exist, don't you think?
Your soul? No, I don't believe in ghosts. We're physical creatures, material objects, just a collection of highly organized atoms. When your brain flatlines, that's it. Game over.
So you don't believe in life after death?
No. I mean, it's a comforting thought, but there's just no scientific evidence for it. I'd rather face the real world than believe in a fairy tale.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sam. It's best to face reality, but it may be that life after death is reality. I mean, think about it. If life just ends at death, then everything we do or say comes to nothing. What meaning or purpose can our lives possibly have?
Well, I guess my life has whatever meaning I choose to give it. I personally believe in truth, beauty, science, making the world a better place, saving the environment, freedom of speech, and, tolerance.
Yes, that's all well and good. But what does all that matter if it ends in nothingness? What are your thoughts about God?
Which God? There are millions of gods.
The God that's in the Bible.
It's been proven that the Bible is just a bunch of mythology written by ancient desert nomads. But if faith in God makes you feel good, I won't argue with that. But I personally prefer more of a rational, open-minded approach to life. Here's what I believe, Sasha. You shouldn't think anything is true unless it's been scientifically proven.
But has that belief itself been scientifically proven? Sam, you and I look at life very differently.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like we're from different worlds.
Not different worlds, different worldviews. A worldview is the set of lenses through which you see the world around you. It's a web of habit-forming beliefs that helps you make sense of all your experiences. Through your worldview, you interpret life in a particular way. It affects how you think, feel, and how you live from day to day. To understand what your worldview is, think carefully about the big questions of life. Does God exist? How did everything begin? Who am I? Why am I here? Am I living a good life? What happens after I die? Cabbages and puppies don't think about this stuff, but people do. Reflecting on these questions is part of what makes us human. In fact, every one of us has a worldview. What's yours?
So some good questions there, and obviously we've been looking at the wider question of what is a worldview. So I'm just going to try and have a look here at, let's see if we can share the screen again and go back to the original presentation here. So what is a worldview? You're exploring this on the Philip project, and what I want you to think about as we meet on Saturday and have a chat live is some of those questions. Does God exist? What happens when we die? What is the good life? Is there a sort of meaning to life, or is that something we subjectively create? What do you think of this idea of a worldview, that you don't just look at reality exactly the same as everybody else, but we all bring our values, our personality, our upbringing, our belief systems, and they are kind of like, as we said, those spectacles that Immanuel Kant said you can never take off. They're always on you all the time. Hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss these questions as you begin this wonderful Philip project discussion, and I look forward to meeting you on Saturday and having a chat about that then. Thank you very much.